Those are the bluegrass sounds of Jimmy Osborne singing Thank God for Victory in Korea. I titled this section The Sequel in Korea, which is in many ways the final chapter of the Second World War. Often called the Forgotten War, Korea took the lives of 54,000 American men and women and resulted in a world situation that right now is rather shaky, shall we say. So what we need to do is we need to understand the division of Korea, and then the invasion of Korea, and then to the Yalu River, followed by the entry of the Chinese, and then finally the armistice that is signed in 1953. And this picture, more than anything, helps you understand the curious dichotomy of the Korean War as a very highly technological war is fought on a peninsula on which many, many rural agricultural people lived. The old name for Korea was Chosin, Chosin. It came under the domination of Japan in 1910 and was part of what was considered to be at the time Japan proper. During the Second World War, of course, Soviet troops invaded into the Korean peninsula as far as the capital of Pyongyang to the north, or the city of Pyongyang to the north. And U.S. troops and Allied troops occupied the southern portion of the peninsula around the city of Seoul and Busan. At the end of the war, the United Nations decided to divide the spheres of influence along the 38th parallel, which you see in the green arrow, the green line right there. And the North would be administered by the Soviets, and the North Koreans, who were led by Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung is the grandfather of the current leader of Korea, North Korea, Kim Jong-un, or as I call him, Little Kim. He was Soviet. Kim Il-sung was Soviet-backed and put together an industrial Marxist-style country with its capital at Pyongyang. I'm going to be able to speak clearly in about 10 minutes, I think. The South, which was the U.S.-run portion, was established as the Republic of Korea under an elderly doctor named Syngman Rhee. This was a largely agrarian region of Korea. Its capital city was Seoul, which was very close to the 38th parallel. Throughout this whole thing, both Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee agreed on one thing and one thing only, is that Korea should have been united as one. And in 1950, the North decided to invade the South and unify the entire Korean peninsula. This was against the directions of the United Nations, and now the newly formed United Nations, just 5 years old, is confronted with one of its first major crises. The UN passes a resolution calling for a ceasefire. Now, a resolution's great, but it doesn't cause a ceasefire. The UN decides then that it's going to put a force into the field, a coalition of forces led by the United States, and they name Douglas MacArthur as the United Nations commander. Douglas MacArthur, who was serving as the military governor, or proconsul, if you will, of Japan, received word that the Korean War was beginning, and he responded, Mars's last gift to an old soldier. The situation in Korea was not good at the time for the Allies. The North Koreans had overrun Seoul and were pushing south, and the men that were holding the line were pushed into a pocket around the city of Busan, and they established what was called the Busan Perimeter. Well, the first thing MacArthur does is he tells every one of the occupation forces in Japan, get a rifle and get over to Korea. But wait a minute, sir. We are clerks. We are typists. We're bakers. He says, you are soldiers first. You know how to fire a weapon. Get over there. And so MacArthur throws as many people as he can spare to the Busan Perimeter. But he's not going to stay at the Busan Perimeter. He's going to come up with one of the greatest and perhaps most reckless invasion plans in the entire history of military warfare. On the left is Syngman Rhee, and on the right is Kim Il-sung, whose son Kim Jong-il became the dear leader, and now Kim Jong-un is the current dear leader of Korea. Now MacArthur plans his master stroke. On September the 15th, 1950, he sends the United States Army and Marines to Incheon, which is the port city that serves the city of Seoul. He is going to land his army behind the lines. Now, in order to do this, he has to land his army at precisely the right moments because the tides at Incheon range 40 feet. And if he doesn't pull his ships out in time after getting the soldiers debarked, then the ships will be stranded on the sand and they will be sitting ducks. He pulls it off and destroys the North Korean army in the process. Now, the UN resolution was for the North Korean army to evacuate the South. There's no other part of that resolution. Now Douglas MacArthur becomes, once again, Douglas MacArthur, and decides the time is right, we are going to unify the Korean Peninsula. There's one little problem. Many of MacArthur's advisors are telling him that the North Koreans apparently are not fighting alone. They are seeing evidence that there's another army that is helping them, at least in an advisory capacity, and maybe even in a greater capacity, and that is the Chinese. When the war broke out and the U.S. was beginning to push forward, again, the Cold War, remember, neither of the two nations involved in the Cold War fought each other directly. Stalin, who was supporting the North Koreans, goes to Mao and he says, I'll tell you what, I can't go fight the U.S. directly. That'll start World War III. But you can start fighting the U.S. directly. And Mao says, well, I'm not going to do that, but what I am going to do is I'm going to send Red Army groups over and I'm going to claim that they are simply volunteers to help another communist power. And they do that. And by the way, after September of 1950, it is starting to get very cold on the Korean Peninsula. The northern monsoon winds are coming off of the Siberian Plateau. This makes Korea a very cold place in the winter. The Yalu River, which is the border between China and North Korea, freezes over, and the Red Chinese volunteers had used the frozen Yalu River to pour over and infiltrate and then invade en masse. And once again now, despite his belief that the Chinese wouldn't get involved, MacArthur finds himself in a very serious situation. The U.S. forces are now in full retreat back across the 38th parallel. But in the midst of all this comes one of the great heroic stories and one of the great stories of the Marine Corps. Around a hydroelectric dam-made lake called the Chosin Reservoir, remember Chosin, the old name for Korea, which was frozen over, the United States Marine Corps now found itself cut off from the coast and from their lines of supply. And so they reversed their army and began attacking southeast toward the port of Hungnam. When one of the reporters asked the Marine Corps general, what is the nature of this retreat? The general said, this is not a retreat. We are attacking in the opposite direction. The Chosin Reservoir did not lose a single man. Not a single dead man was left behind for the Chinese to despoil, and only 7 prisoners of war were captured. The reason that this retreat was so successful was because we had absolute air superiority during this retreat. Nonetheless, the United Nations forces are pushed back over the 38th parallel, and now MacArthur, who has been shown to have been wrong in his estimation about the Chinese, now says that in order to prosecute this war properly, I'm going to need to use nuclear weapons, and I'm going to need to invade China. I'm going to have to cross over the Yalu and invade China proper. And President Truman says, if we do that, General MacArthur, we will start a much wider war, and we do not want to start a nuclear war. MacArthur forgets his place and begins to attack Truman publicly in a series of articles that he writes. This is insubordinate. The President of the United States is the Commander-in-Chief. Truman is forced to relieve MacArthur of command to assert civilian control of the military. MacArthur comes home at last to a ticker tape parade, New York's Fifth Avenue, and then he is asked to address a joint session of Congress. What you see here on the map, you notice that the Pusan perimeter down in the lower right-hand corner. And then you see the invasion at Incheon, behind the lines. Once they have destroyed the North Korean army, then Douglas MacArthur moves the UN forces toward the north, toward the Yalu River. And it is the dead of winter. And then you see that the Chinese forces come across the frozen Yalu and forces the United States Army to retreat and the U.S. Marine Corps to attack in the opposite direction. Now, let me give you an example of just how cold it was. There is a gentleman who helped my uncle on his campaign for judge who always had a limp when he walked. And we used to ask him, Mr. Pete, why are you limping like that? And he would always say, I'll tell you another time, son. Until we were old enough to know that Pete, this man, was a Marine who was at the Chosin Reservoir. He caught a piece of shrapnel in his lower leg that damn near shredded his leg to smithereens. Had it been the summer, he would have bled to death, but because it was so cold that the arterial shredded ends froze solid and kept him from losing his leg. He eventually was brought back, carried by two of his closest friends to an aid station where they treated him, put him on a helicopter, sent him out to a ship. They saved his leg, and he had a limp the rest of his life, but he had a leg on which to limp. After 3 years of bloody stalemate in which MacArthur was replaced by General Matthew Ridgway, the sides finally came together at a town named Panmunjom and negotiated a peace. The peace was drawn out as well. The UN forces, represented by the Americans, the British, and a variety of other forces, negotiated with China, North Korea, and South Korea. And just to show you just how much diplomats can really make a mess of things, they argued for about 2 weeks over how the table would be shaped while men were dying. They signed the armistice on July the 26th, 1953. The armistice terms were very simple. The 38th parallel would be restored. This is not a peace treaty. A state of war still exists between the United States and North Korea. And the legacy of Korea is that it is the forgotten war. And we have lasting problems with North Korea to this day. And the signs are pointing toward the possibility of a war with that nuclear nation. There's a belief also that comes out of the Korean conflict that you can survive with split nations, that one nation split into two is not necessarily a bad thing. That is going to kind of bite the United States on the rear end. And then there is, of course, the great story about the Korean War in the book that was made into a movie, that was made into a TV series, MASH, Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, which was the #1 show running. The final, the series finale of MASH in 1983-84 was the most watched television program in all history until the New Orleans Saints won the Super Bowl. The picture you see there is called the Freedom Tower, erected by the North Koreans, who love to build these big giant things, even though they don't have enough money to feed their people, because they keep one of the largest militaries on the face of the earth. The book MASH was written by the author Richard Hooker, and that is the cover of the book. That was later turned into a movie starring Elliott Gould, Donald Sutherland, Sally Kellerman, Tom Skerritt, Robert Duvall, and Fred the Hammer Williamson. It then was turned into an award-winning TV series, MASH, that for the first 3 years was a comedy wrapped around the seriousness of war, and then for its last 8 years was a serious comedy, so to speak. And in the lower right, you see the late Wayne Rogers on the left, who played Dr. John McIntyre, nicknamed Trapper John. And on the right, the very young-looking Alan Alda, who played Dr. Benjamin Franklin Pierce, who went by the nickname Hawkeye. And it's about